She ripped the oxygen tube from my face while I was fighting to breathe, and my parents stood 3 feet away and said nothing. 2 weeks later, at my grandfather's will reading, a doctor placed his hand on her shoulder and said 6 words that shattered everything she thought she controlled. How did it come to that? How does a sister go from shared childhood bedrooms to watching you choke without blinking? My name is April Warren. I'm 35 years old, a healthcare consultant based in Denver. I help hospitals streamline operations, cut waste, and keep critical systems from collapsing under pressure. Ironically, I've built a career on making sure other people can breathe easier while quietly managing a chronic lung disease that sometimes makes breathing feel like dragging air through a straw. I don't usually talk about my health. I manage it with discipline, medication schedules, controlled environments, regular checkups. Most of my colleagues don't even know. And my family, they don't know either. Not because it's a secret, but because they've never cared enough to ask. I grew up in Colorado Springs, in a house where attention moved in one direction, toward my younger sister, Hannah. From the time I was 8 and she was 2, I learned my role. Hannah was delicate. Hannah was sensitive. Hannah needed extra reassurance, extra protection, extra love. If she cried, the world stopped. If she failed, it was someone else's fault. If she succeeded, it was a family celebration. And me? I was the strong one, the one who didn't need much, the one who could handle disappointment, the one who was told, "You're older, you understand." I understood more than they realized. I understood that if I wanted peace, I had to shrink. I had to be easy. I had to swallow hurt before it made anyone uncomfortable. There are small moments that define a childhood. Mine came the day my parents forgot my 12th birthday because Hannah had a dance recital. I remember standing behind my grandfather's tool shed, trying not to cry loud enough for anyone to hear. My grandfather, Charles Warren, found me there. He didn't ask me to be strong. He didn't tell me to understand. He knelt down, wiped my tears with his rough hands, and said, "April, you are a gem hidden in darkness. One day, the light will find you." At 12, I didn't fully grasp what he meant. I just knew that for the first time that day, someone saw me. He was the only one who ever consistently did. Fast forward 23 years. 2 weeks ago, my grandfather died. I drove 4 hours from Denver to Colorado Springs the moment I heard. The call came late 3 days before he passed. No one had told me he was declining. By the time I arrived, he was already gone. At the funeral, I stood in the back of the church while Hannah sobbed theatrically in the front pew. Relatives hovered around her with tissues and whispered sympathy. My mother announced to anyone who would listen that Hannah had been such a comfort during Grandpa's final days, while I had been so busy with work. Busy. That word stung. I had called my grandfather every Sunday for 15 years. We talked about books, politics, history, the strange ways families love imperfectly. But none of that was visible in that church. What was visible was Hannah's performance. After the service, she cornered me near the coat closet. Her mascara was perfectly intact despite the tears she displayed moments earlier. "Grandpa left everything to me," she whispered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The house, the investments, all of it. You should probably start getting used to that." She patted my cheek like I was a child. Some of us were actually there for him. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell her about the phone calls, about how Grandpa sent me articles, about how he asked about my work. But I didn't. Old habits are hard to break. I absorbed the blow. I always did. That night, the altitude shift from Denver, the stress, the grief, it was too much. I woke at 2 a.m., with my chest locked tight, like iron bands were squeezing my ribs. My inhaler wasn't enough. The air felt thin, sharp. Panic makes breathing worse, and the worse it gets, the more you panic. I called 911. The next thing I remember clearly is the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital. Fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, an oxygen tube fitted beneath my nose, the sterile scent of antiseptic and plastic. When my family arrived the following morning, I expected concern. Instead, my mother stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed. April, you always make everything complicated. We have the will reading to prepare for. My father glanced at his phone, muttering something about scheduling conflicts. Hannah looked at me and shrugged. She's probably exaggerating. She always did love attention. Attention. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't have enough air. I tried explaining that my oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low. That chronic obstructive lung disease isn't something you fake for sympathy. But my mother just sighed. We'll come back later. There are more pressing matters. They left. Hannah stayed. I'll keep you company, she said sweetly. The moment our parents disappeared down the hallway, her expression changed. The softness drained from her face. She glanced toward the door, making sure we were alone, and then she reached for the oxygen tube. At first, I thought she was adjusting it. Maybe it had slipped, but her fingers tightened. She pulled. The air vanished instantly. My chest collapsed inward like a crushed soda can. My lungs clawed at emptiness. Black spots flickered across my vision. I reached up instinctively, trying to grab the tube back, but my arms felt weak, slow. Stop pretending, she hissed. You just want pity. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even form words. All I could do was gasp, raw, desperate sounds I didn't recognize as my own. I remember seeing my parents still in the room, my mother's silhouette near the window, my father's reflection in the glass. Neither of them moved. For a second, I thought maybe they didn't understand what was happening. Maybe they believed her. Maybe they always had. My throat burned. My ears rang. I felt myself slipping, like I was falling through water. And then the door opened. Dr. Marcus Keller stood in the doorway. He took in the scene in a single glance, Hannah standing over me, the oxygen line dangling from her hand, my body convulsing for breath. He moved fast, reattached the tube, checked the flow, adjusted the monitor. His hands were steady, precise. Air rushed back into my lungs in sharp, painful bursts. It felt like inhaling broken glass, but it was air. He turned slowly to Hannah. "What did you just do?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Hannah stammered something about the tube being loose, about helping me fix it. But there was something in Dr. Keller's eyes, something cold, calculating, as if this wasn't just a misunderstanding, as if he had just seen something he'd suspected for a long time. He ordered her to leave. She protested, claiming he was overreacting, but he didn't waver. Eventually, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering about ungrateful sisters. I lay there trembling, the oxygen hissing softly beside me, my throat raw, my heart pounding. For 35 years, I had believed I was invisible, but in that moment, someone saw exactly what was happening. And what none of my family knew, what would unravel everything they believed they controlled, was that Dr. Marcus Keller wasn't just a witness. He had known my grandfather. And in 2 weeks, at the will reading, he would stand in front of my entire family and speak the words that changed my life forever. When Dr. Keller came back to my room the next morning, he didn't come in with the rushed efficiency of a physician doing rounds. He closed the door behind him. He pulled a chair closer to my bed, and he sat down like a man about to say something that carried weight. I had barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I felt phantom hands at my face, phantom fingers tugging at the thin line that kept me alive. My body was stabilizing oxygen levels, climbing back into safe numbers, but emotionally, something inside me had cracked open. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "How are you feeling today, April?" It was such a normal question, but no one in my family had asked it. Physically, I managed. Better. I hesitated. Everything else, I'm not sure. He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. Then he said the words that shifted the entire axis of my world. "I knew your grandfather." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. My grandfather had always seemed larger than life to me, solid, steady, separate from the sterile brightness of hospital corridors. Hearing his name here felt surreal. Dr. Keller leaned back slightly, folding his hands. I was his cardiologist for 5 years. He came in regularly. Checkups, follow-ups after his surgery. We talked. The room felt very still. We talked about many things, he continued, but he talked about you often. The words hit me harder than Hannah's cruelty ever could. About me? My voice sounded small. He nodded. He was proud of you. Proud. That word shouldn't have felt foreign, but it did. Dr. Keller reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a folder, worn at the edges. He placed it carefully on the tray table beside my bed. He gave this to me 6 months ago, he said, with specific instructions. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed interviews, professional articles from industry journals. My name appeared in headlines I hadn't thought twice about at the time. Pieces about hospital systems I had helped restructure. A feature on how my consulting team prevented a rural facility from closing. An interview where I talked about operational ethics and patient-centered care. And in the margins of nearly every article, in the slanted handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and old notes, were short messages. My granddaughter did this. So proud of her resilience. She built this on her own. The tears came without warning. For years, I had told myself that achievements didn't matter if the people who raised you didn't acknowledge them. That maybe I was too ambitious, too distant, too focused on work. But he had been watching, collecting pieces of my life like treasures. I didn't know, I whispered. Dr. Keller's expression softened. He wanted you to know. He just wasn't always sure how to say it directly. That sounded like Grandpa, loving deeply, but sometimes quietly, protecting in subtle ways. There's more, Dr. Keller said after a moment. Something in his tone shifted. He explained that 3 years ago, during one of Grandpa's follow-up appointments, the conversation had turned serious. Grandpa had seemed worried not about his heart, but about his family. He said something I haven't forgotten, Dr. Keller continued. He said, April is the granddaughter my family forgot. If she ever ends up here needing help, please make sure she's not alone. The words hollowed me out. Not alone. My grandfather had known. He had seen the imbalance, the quiet dismissals, the way I was expected to be self-sufficient to the point of invisibility. He made me promise, Doctor. Keller said simply, I didn't expect the promise to matter like this. Neither did I. For 35 years, I had carried the belief that I was fundamentally less lovable, less deserving of softness. But here was proof that at least one person had seen the truth. I wiped my face and tried to steady myself. Why would he think I'd need protection? Dr. Keller hesitated. He chose his next words carefully, and I respected him for that. He was concerned about your sister, he said, about some decisions she had made. My chest tightened not from lack of air this time, but from dread. He didn't speak in accusations. He spoke in facts he had learned over time, pieced together through conversations and observations. Hannah had invested in a business venture 2 years ago. It collapsed. The debt that followed was significant, nearly $200,000. She had kept it quiet, maintained appearances, borrowed, charged, deferred. Grandpa had found out when creditors began calling his home, asking for her. She was under pressure, Dr. Keller said evenly. A great deal of it. Suddenly, the funeral whisper echoed in my ears. Grandpa left everything to me. At the time, it had sounded like arrogance. Now it felt like desperation. And then there was Nurse Rosa. Later that afternoon, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver threading her dark hair, came into my room to adjust my IV. She introduced herself gently. Rosa Martinez. She had been the one standing near the doorway yesterday. I saw what happened, she told me quietly once we were alone. There was no drama in her voice, just certainty. She described the moment Hannah removed my oxygen tube, how she stood there instead of calling for help, how it wasn't confusion, it was deliberate. I've worked here 20 years, Rosa said. I know the difference between panic and intent. Her words didn't inflame me. They grounded me. Then she hesitated. I was also on shift the night your grandfather passed. The air seemed to thin again. She explained carefully. That night, Grandpa had been stable, recovering. Doctors were optimistic. Hannah had come late, close to 11, insisting on time alone with him. Rosa had thought it was sweet. A granddaughter wanting private goodbyes. 30 minutes later, Alarms sounded. When staff rushed in, Grandpa had stopped breathing. The breathing equipment had shifted slightly, not completely removed, but displaced enough to compromise airflow. These things can happen accidentally. Elderly patients move, tubes shift. There had been no formal investigation, but Rosa remembered Hannah's composure. The calm, the stillness. She didn't look shocked, Rosa said softly. She looked prepared. There was no accusation in her tone, only unease. I didn't leap to conclusions. I couldn't. There was no proof, no evidence that would stand in court. But patterns began aligning in my mind in ways I couldn't ignore. And then Dr. Keller added one final piece. 3 days before your grandfather passed, he said, he requested his lawyer. He changed his will. The world didn't tilt. It didn't spin. It sharpened. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just the quiet observer absorbing damage. I was standing in the center of a truth that had been building for years. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want scandal. I wanted clarity. I wanted the lies that had shaped my childhood to stop operating in the dark. I looked at Dr. Keller and Rosa, two people who had no obligation to me beyond professional duty, and realized something profound. They had shown up for me more in 24 hours than my own family had in decades. Will you stand with me? I asked. Neither of them hesitated. And as the date of the will reading approached, I felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Not fear, not sadness, strength. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I understood something I had spent my entire life avoiding. Silence had never protected me. It had only protected everyone else from discomfort. My parents arrived the morning I was cleared to leave. My mother stood beside the window, arms folded, her posture already defensive, as if she anticipated criticism. My father hovered near the door, glancing at his watch like this was another inconvenient appointment to get through. Hannah entered last. She looked different from the ICU scene, softer, almost fragile. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup light, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently, pulling a chair close to my bed. The question sounded rehearsed. "I'm stable," I replied. "That's good." She reached out, brushing imaginary lint from the hospital blanket. "You scared us." I almost laughed at that. I had been the one struggling for air while she watched. My mother cleared her throat. "The will reading is in 2 days," she said briskly. "Your grandfather's attorney insisted we all attend. We need to handle this quickly. We can't let things drag out." There it was, again, efficiency over emotion. Estate paperwork over ICU monitors. I nodded slowly. "I'll be there." Hannah's eyes flickered, just for a second. Something passed across her face, calculation, maybe relief that I wasn't planning to make a scene. On the drive home to my parents' house, I stared out the window at streets that once felt familiar. The air in Colorado Springs felt thinner than in Denver, and I could already feel my lungs adjusting. But the tightness in my chest had less to do with altitude, and more to do with what I now knew. Grandpa had changed his will 3 days before he died. He had prepared something, and Dr. Keller and Rosa were willing to stand beside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a family gathering alone. The night before the will reading, Hannah knocked softly on the guest room door. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her tone was hesitant, almost sisterly. It would have worked on the old version of me. I gestured for her to come in. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. "I know things have been tense," she began. "You've always been sensitive, and sometimes I don't phrase things the right way. Sensitive." I felt the words settle between us like an old insult dressed up as concern. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she continued, "but you have to understand. Grandpa and I were close at the end. I was there. You weren't." I held her gaze. "No one told me he was declining." She blinked. Surprised, I answered directly. "Well, we didn't want to stress you out," she said quickly. "With your condition and everything." My condition. Suddenly, it was real enough to mention. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Look, if Grandpa left things the way I think he did, it's not about favoritism. It's about practicality. I need help right now. You're doing fine. You have your condo, your career." There it was. Not love, not memory. Need. I didn't mention the debt. I didn't mention the folder of clippings in my suitcase. I simply said, "We'll see what he wanted." Her jaw tightened slightly before she forced another smile. Of course. When she left the room, I exhaled slowly. For years, I had been the one adjusting my behavior to keep peace. This time, I wasn't adjusting anything. The morning of the will reading, the sky was painfully clear. The kind of Colorado blue that looks almost artificial. I met Dr. Keller and Rosa in the parking lot of Thomas Reed's law office downtown. Seeing them there, two steady presences in a situation that had once terrified me, felt surreal. "You don't have to do this," I told them quietly. Rosa smiled. "Some things deserve witnesses." Dr. Keller gave me a small nod. "Your grandfather asked for clarity. We're here to provide it." Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. My parents were already seated at the long mahogany table. Hannah sat beside my mother, scrolling through her phone, projecting nonchalance. When she looked up and saw who stood behind me, the color drained from her face. "What are they doing here?" she demanded immediately. Thomas Reed, my grandfather's attorney and longtime friend, adjusted his glasses calmly. "They're here at your grandfather's request." Hannah's composure cracked for just a second before she masked it with indignation. "This is a private family matter." Reed's voice remained even. "Your grandfather anticipated that clarity might be necessary." My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother avoided my eyes. We all sat. Reed began with formalities, his voice steady and precise. He outlined the structure of the estate, the properties involved, the financial holdings. The tension in the room thickened with every word. Then he reached the section regarding the family home. "The primary residence," he read, "valued at approximately $800,000, is to be divided equally among Linda Warren, Richard Warren, and April Warren." Silence. It was Hannah who broke it. "That's not possible," she said sharply. "There must be a mistake." Reed looked at her over his glasses. "There is no mistake. You said equally among three parties," she pressed. "You forgot my name." "I did not," he replied. The shift in her expression was almost physical, like a crack running through glass. "There are additional provisions," Reed continued. He gestured toward Dr. Keller. I felt every eye in the room turn. Dr. Keller stood slowly, his presence calm but immovable. He explained his professional relationship with my grandfather, the years of appointments, the conversations. He spoke carefully, factually, about what he had witnessed in my hospital room, about the oxygen tube, about the intervention. Hannah's face went pale. "That's absurd," she snapped. "She's twisting things." Rosa rose next, her voice quiet but unwavering. She confirmed she had been at the doorway, that she had seen the tube removed, that no call for help had been made. My mother gasped softly. My father stared at the table. Reed opened another envelope. He read a letter addressed specifically to Hannah. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its honesty. Grandpa acknowledged loving her deeply, but loving her in a way that shielded her from consequences. He wrote that he had come to understand that protection without accountability becomes harm. He admitted he didn't know exactly what had happened in his final days, but he knew enough to question intentions. Hannah's composure disintegrated. "You're all conspiring against me," she said, her voice breaking. "April, tell them." I didn't move. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to smooth things over. Then Reed opened the final document. "The mountain retreat property in Estes Park," he read, "is to be granted in full to my granddaughter, April Warren, along with a medical trust fund established for her ongoing health care." The room went still. Hannah stared at me like she didn't recognize me. And in that moment, I realized something profound. For years, I thought strength meant endurance. It meant staying quiet, absorbing unfairness, proving my worth through achievement. But real strength was sitting in that chair, breathing steadily, while the truth unfolded without apologizing for existing. The reading wasn't over yet, but the balance of power had already shifted. The air in that room changed after the mountain retreat was mentioned. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray turning points. No one slammed a fist on the table, no glass shattered, but something invisible shifted. The power dynamic that had defined my family for decades cracked quietly down the middle. Hannah was still standing when the lawyer finished reading that portion. Her hands were gripping the back of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. "That house was supposed to be mine," she said, her voice thin but sharp. "Grandpa told me I'd be taken care of." Thomas Reed didn't argue. He simply opened another envelope. "This," he said, "is a personal letter Charles left specifically for you, Hannah, to be read in the presence of the family." The silence that followed was suffocating in a different way than the ICU had been. There was no oxygen monitor beeping this time, just the ticking of a wall clock and the weight of expectation pressing against everyone's chest. Reed unfolded the letter and began to read. "Hannah, I loved you the wrong way," he started. Hannah's face froze. "I mistook protection for love. I believed that if I shielded you from consequences long enough, you would eventually choose kindness on your own. But love without accountability becomes harm." My mother made a small, strangled sound. My father stared at the table as if he were trying to memorize the wood grain. Reed continued, "I do not know every detail of what has transpired in my final months, but I know what I have observed. I know what I felt. And I know that character reveals itself not when life is easy, but when someone else is vulnerable." Hannah shook her head violently. "This is manipulation," she said. "He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly." "Doctor." Keller stood then, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a quiet certainty that commanded attention. "Your grandfather was of sound mind," he said evenly. "Up until his final days." There was no accusation in his voice, just fact. Reed lowered the letter and looked at Hannah over his glasses. "Your grandfather revised his will 3 days before his passing. The documentation was properly witnessed and notarized." Hannah's breathing grew uneven. I recognized that pattern. Panic creeping in when control slips away. "This is because of her," she said suddenly, pointing at me. "She's always been jealous. She probably convinced him I was some kind of monster." I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to defend myself, to soften the blow, to say something that would de-escalate the situation. But I didn't. Dr. Keller spoke before I could. "No one needed convincing," he said quietly. "I saw what happened in that hospital room." The words hung in the air. Hannah laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "You walked in at the wrong moment. It was an accident." "Was it?" Rosa's voice was calm, almost gentle. She stood beside Keller now, not confrontational, just present, because I was at the doorway. "I saw you remove the oxygen line. I saw you hesitate before calling for help." My mother turned slowly toward Hannah. "Hesitate?" she whispered. Hannah's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to interrupt, to dismiss this as exaggeration. No one did. Reed cleared his throat and opened a folder. In addition to the testimony provided, there are nursing notes from that evening, documenting equipment displacement. There is also hallway footage showing who entered and exited the ICU room. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Hannah's composure shattered. "You're trying to ruin me," she said to me, her voice cracking. "Over nothing. Over nothing." For a moment, I felt 12 years old again, standing behind Grandpa's tool shed, being told my feelings were an overreaction, being told I misunderstood, that I was too sensitive. But this time, I wasn't alone, and I wasn't unsure. Dr. Keller stepped closer, not invading her space, just enough to make his presence undeniable. He placed his hand flat on the polished table in front of her and leaned slightly forward. "I saw what you did, Hannah." 6 words. They weren't shouted. They weren't theatrical. But they carried the weight of finality. The room went silent. Hannah's face drained of color, then flushed deep red. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Words failed her. For the first time in my entire life, she didn't have an immediate counter-narrative. Reed resumed reading the letter. "If you are hearing this," he continued, "it means you have not yet learned that love is not an entitlement. It is a responsibility. I hope one day you choose differently." The letter ended without cruelty, without drama, just quiet disappointment. And somehow, that was worse. Hannah sank into her chair. The anger that had animated her moments earlier dissolved into something more frantic. "You don't understand," she said, looking at my parents now. "I was under pressure. The business failed. I didn't mean for things to spiral. I just needed time." There it was. The truth she had hidden. My father looked up slowly. "What business?" he asked. Her eyes widened slightly. "You didn't tell them," I said softly, not accusing, just stating fact. Silence answered for her. The financial strain, the debt, the desperation, it all clicked into place for my parents in real time. I watched comprehension dawn on their faces, followed by something else. Guilt? For years, they had believed they were protecting her, supporting her, encouraging her sensitivity. They had never asked whether she was learning responsibility. Reed set the letter aside and folded his hands. There remains one final personal document for April. My name sounded different in that room now. Reed handed me the envelope directly this time. The paper felt fragile in my hands, like it carried more than ink. I opened it carefully. "My dearest April," it began. The words blurred almost immediately. He wrote about the tool shed, about the girl who tried not to cry too loudly. He wrote about watching me build a life without applause, about regretting that he hadn't confronted my parents sooner. "I always saw you," I read aloud, my voice shaking, even when others did not. The room felt smaller, not claustrophobic, just focused. Hannah wasn't the center anymore. For decades, every family moment revolved around her moods, her triumphs, her disappointments. Today, the narrative had shifted. Not because I demanded it, because the truth demanded it. When I finished reading, no one spoke for several seconds. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were wet. My father's hands were trembling slightly against the table. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt visible in a way that didn't depend on their approval. Hannah finally found her voice again. "April," she said. And this time there was no arrogance in it, only fear. "You're not going to take this further, are you?" The question lingered in the air. Because beyond inheritance, beyond letters, there were consequences she had just begun to understand. I inhaled slowly, steady, and controlled. Breathing had once felt like something she could take from me. Now it felt like something I owned. And I realized that the most powerful decision I would make that day wasn't about property or money. It was about what I chose to carry forward and what I finally chose to leave behind. When Hannah asked if I was going to take this further, the question didn't sound defiant. It sounded terrified. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. My grandfather's letter was still trembling slightly in my hands. The words "I always saw you" echoed in my chest like something sacred, something I had waited my entire life to hear. Thomas Reed cleared his throat gently. His tone shifted from personal to professional. "April," he said, "given what has been documented and witnessed, you have options. The hospital incident alone could warrant a formal complaint or even legal action if you choose to pursue it." The word legal landed heavily. Hannah's head snapped toward me. "You wouldn't," she whispered. My mother leaned forward, panic rising in her voice. "Let's not escalate this. We're family." Family. That word had been used my whole life as both shield and weapon. It meant endure. It meant excuse. It meant protect the image at all costs. Dr. Keller didn't interrupt. He didn't pressure me. He simply stood there, steady as he had been in the ICU, offering presence instead of direction. Rose's expression was calm but resolute. They weren't pushing for punishment. They were pushing for truth. And suddenly I understood something clearly. For the first time, the decision was mine. Not Hannah's mood, not my parents' expectations, not a childhood role carved into me. Mine. Hannah slid out of her chair and moved toward me quickly, dropping to her knees beside my seat. It was such a dramatic gesture that under different circumstances it might have seemed absurd, but there was nothing theatrical in her face now. Her mascara had smudged. Her voice trembled. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. "I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. I would never actually hurt you." The memory of air vanishing from my lungs flashed through me. "You pulled the tube," I said quietly. It slipped, she insisted, but the words lacked conviction. I thought you were exaggerating. You've always been dramatic about health stuff. There it was again. The reframing. The rewriting of events to fit her comfort. My father finally spoke, his voice fragile. Hannah, were you really in that much trouble financially? She hesitated. The hesitation was answer enough. I was going to fix it, she said defensively. I just needed time. The inheritance would have solved everything. The inheritance. Not Grandpa's memory. Not his values. The money. And for the first time, I saw my sister not as the golden child who stole every spotlight, but as someone who had never been forced to stand without one. Someone who had grown up cushioned from consequences so completely that reality felt like betrayal when it arrived. I removed my hands gently from her grip. I'm not suing you, I said. The words startled even me. Relief flooded her face instantly. Thank you, she breathed. I knew you wouldn't. But I held up my hand before she could continue. I'm not suing you, I repeated, because I refuse to spend the next 5 years of my life tied to you in courtrooms and depositions. I refuse to wake up every day reliving that hospital room. You already took too much of my oxygen. I'm not giving you any more. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. This wasn't shock. It was absorption. I'm choosing peace, I continued. But peace doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. Hannah's expression shifted again, confusion creeping in. What does that mean? It means, I said steadily, that from today forward, you are not part of my life. The words didn't shake. They didn't come out angry. They came out clear. No calls, no holidays, no pretending at family dinners. I'm done shrinking myself so you can feel larger. My mother gasped softly. April, don't say that. She's your sister. I turned toward her slowly. She was my sister. That distinction hung in the air like something fragile and irreversible. My father looked stricken. Can't we just move forward? He asked. As a family? I considered him carefully. I wasn't fueled by rage. I wasn't even fueled by revenge. I was fueled by exhaustion. I'm willing to try with you, I said finally, meeting both my parents' eyes, but not the way things were. If you want me in your lives, there will be boundaries. Real ones, therapy, accountability. No more pretending I'm the strong one who doesn't need anything. My mother's tears fell freely now. I didn't realize. You did, I said gently. You just didn't want to. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. Reed gathered the documents quietly, giving the moment space. There would be paperwork to finalize, assets to transfer, logistics to handle, but the emotional inheritance had already been delivered. Hannah rose slowly from the floor. The fight had drained out of her. What remained wasn't remorse, it was disorientation. The world she had relied on, where charm and denial could reshape reality, had cracked. You're overreacting, she muttered weakly, but there was no fire behind it. Maybe in her mind, I always would be dramatic, sensitive, difficult. But for the first time, that narrative didn't belong to me. As we left the office, Dr. Keller walked beside me down the hallway. You handled that with more strength than most people ever find, he said quietly. It doesn't feel strong, I admitted. It rarely does, he replied. Outside, the air was crisp. Colorado sunlight filtered between buildings, sharp and clean. I inhaled deeply, testing my lungs. They responded steadily. For years, I thought justice meant punishment, exposure, consequences that matched the harm. But standing there, I realized justice can also mean removal, refusal, stepping out of a system that requires your silence to function. Hannah would have to face her debt. She would have to explain to extended family why her name wasn't on the will. She would have to live knowing that 2 medical professionals had witnessed what she tried to minimize. Those were consequences. Not dramatic, not cinematic, permanent. My parents lingered near their car, uncertain how to approach me. The hierarchy had shifted, and they didn't know their positions in this new structure. I didn't gloat. I didn't savor it. I simply felt lighter. Grandpa hadn't left me the mountain retreat as a reward. He had left it as an exit. A place to breathe without being told I was asking for too much air. As I drove away from the law office, I caught my reflection briefly in the rearview mirror. I didn't look triumphant. I looked steady, and for the first time in 35 years, steady was enough. 3 months after the will reading, I stood on the balcony of the mountain retreat house my grandfather had left me and took the deepest breath I could manage. The air in Estes Park was crisp, pine-scented, almost sweet compared to the sterile oxygen that had once hissed through plastic tubing in a hospital room. It still amazed me how different breathing could feel when no one was trying to convince you that your need for it was an inconvenience. The house itself sat on a forested hillside, modest but solid, with wide windows that faced the Rockies. In the early mornings, light poured over the peaks in soft gold, and in the evenings the mountains turned shades of crimson and violet that felt unreal. The first night I slept there, I woke up out of habit at 2 a.m., heart racing, half expecting to find myself back in that ICU bed. But there was no monitor beeping, no tension in the hallway, only wind moving through trees. I had moved slowly, deliberately, not as an escape in panic, but as a choice. I packed my condo in Denver piece by piece, deciding what I truly needed. The articles Grandpa had saved about my career came with me. His rare book collection had already been transported to the retreat under Reed's supervision. I arranged them in the study the way he used to, alphabetized, favorites within arm's reach of the reading chair by the window. Sometimes I ran my fingers over the worn spines just to feel something steady. The healthcare trust fund he established removed a quiet fear I hadn't realized I carried. Chronic illness teaches you to plan for worst-case scenarios. It teaches you that stability can vanish with one bad flare-up. Knowing I wouldn't have to choose between treatment and survival gave me a kind of peace that money itself never could. My parents called twice in the first month after the will reading. The first conversation was awkward, filled with pauses and half apologies. My mother kept circling around the word sorry without fully landing on it. My father asked practical questions about the house, about my drive, about whether the altitude was manageable. It was as if they didn't quite know how to talk to me without Hannah in the room absorbing the focus. I kept my boundaries clear but calm. If we're going to have a relationship, I told them gently, it has to look different. No minimizing, no rewriting history. And I need time. To their credit, they didn't argue. My father mentioned they were considering counseling. I didn't celebrate it. Change isn't proven by words. It's proven by consistency. Hannah didn't call at all. At first, I braced for a dramatic message, an angry voicemail, a long text accusing me of betrayal. Nothing came. Later, through a distant cousin, I learned she was trying to restructure her debt, downsizing her apartment, selling things quietly. The narrative she had built around being untouchable was crumbling, and for once, I wasn't standing beneath it. Dr. Keller visited the retreat about 6 weeks after I moved in. He brought coffee from a small cafe in town and walked the perimeter of the property with me like an old friend, rather than the man who had once reattached my oxygen tube. Your grandfather talked about this place constantly, he told me, gazing out at the trees. He said it was the only place he ever felt completely honest. That made sense. The house didn't carry performance. It didn't demand comparison. It simply existed. We sat on the porch that afternoon, and he shared stories I had never heard, how Grandpa would bring up my name during appointments with pride, disguised as casual commentary. How he'd pretend to complain about modern hospital inefficiencies just to pivot into talking about the work I was doing to improve them. How he worried that I carried too much alone. He knew more than you realized, Keller said quietly. I smiled. I think I'm finally realizing that. Not all healing is dramatic. Some of it happens in repetition. Morning light, evening silence, the absence of criticism in the background of your thoughts. I began writing not for publication at first, but for clarity. Pages about childhood dinners where praise skipped over me, about being told I was mature for my age when what I really was lonely, about how easy it is to confuse endurance with strength. I didn't write to expose Hannah. I wrote to understand myself. One afternoon, while organizing Grandpa's study, I found a thin volume of poetry I remembered from when I was 15. Inside the front cover was an inscription I had somehow missed all those years ago. For April, my strong little girl. One day you will understand your own worth. The date beneath it was written in ink that had slightly faded. I sat down in the reading chair and let the realization settle. For so long, I thought worth was proven, earned, measured in accomplishments that might finally tilt attention in my direction. But worth isn't a competition. It's not something another person grants you by noticing. It exists whether they see it or not. Rosa called me one evening just as the sky was turning deep purple over the mountains. Her voice carried that warm steadiness I'd come to rely on. "How are you breathing up there?" she asked. "Better than I ever have," I answered honestly. She told me something unexpected then. A journalist from a women's magazine had reached out to the hospital after hearing fragments of what happened. Not gossip, just curiosity about resilience, about family dynamics, about survival. "They're not interested in scandal," Rosa clarified. "They're interested in your strength." I laughed softly. It didn't feel strong. "It rarely does," she replied, echoing Keller's words from weeks earlier. After we hung up, I stood on the balcony again. The mountains were dark silhouettes now, but I could still make out their shape against the sky. I thought about that night in the ICU, how small I had felt, how certain I was that invisibility would swallow me whole. I thought about the will reading, about Hannah's panic, about my parents' silence finally cracking. And I realized something important. The story wasn't about exposing her. It was about stepping out of a role that had suffocated me long before an oxygen tube ever did. I didn't need revenge to feel vindicated. I didn't need a courtroom to validate my pain. I needed distance, air, a life not structured around earning scraps of approval. The retreat house wasn't just property. It was permission. Permission to exist without comparison. Permission to take up space. Permission to breathe deeply without someone accusing me of exaggeration. As darkness settled over the mountains, I whispered a quiet thank you, not just to my grandfather, but to the version of myself who finally chose to stop disappearing. And in the stillness of that night, surrounded by pine trees and open sky, I understood what he meant all those years ago behind the tool shed. The light doesn't find you when you prove your worth. It finds you when you stop hiding it. A few weeks after I settled into the mountain retreat, something unexpected happened. Silence, real silence, gave my thoughts room to stretch further than survival. When you're no longer bracing for the next emotional blow, you start noticing what's left behind. At first, I thought peace would feel dramatic, like a cinematic sunrise moment where everything inside you clicks into place. But it didn't arrive that way. It arrived quietly, in the absence of tension, in the way my shoulders stopped sitting near my ears, in the way my lungs expanded without fear of interruption. One afternoon, I was organizing paperwork in Grandpa's study when my phone buzzed. It was my father. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before answering. "Hi," I said carefully. His voice sounded older than I remembered, softer. "Your mother and I started counseling," he said without preamble. The words caught me off guard. "That's good," I replied. There was a pause. "We didn't realize how much we leaned on you to be the stable one," he admitted. "It was easier to praise Hannah's fragility than to confront her behavior." Easier. That word had defined my childhood. It was easier to ask me to adjust. Easier to believe I didn't need attention. Easier to avoid conflict. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything," he continued, "but I want you to know. We're trying to understand." I believed him not fully, not blindly, but enough to acknowledge the effort. "I need time," I said again, "and consistency." "You'll have both," he answered quietly. When the call ended, I didn't feel a rush of relief. I felt cautious optimism. Boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They allow what's healthy through and keep the rest out. Hannah, on the other hand, remained silent. No apology, no message, no attempt to repair. Through extended family, I learned she had moved into a smaller apartment. She had taken on additional work. Some relatives had distanced themselves after the will reading. Not because I campaigned against her, but because truth travels differently once it's spoken out loud. For years, she had thrived on narratives she controlled. Now she was navigating a world that didn't automatically bend around her. There were moments when I wondered if I should reach out, if complete silence was too harsh. But then I would remember the ICU, the sound my throat made when air wouldn't come. The way she stood there, watching. Compassion doesn't require proximity. Healing doesn't require reconciliation. I began writing more seriously after that. At first, it was journaling, then structured chapters. I wrote about being labeled the strong one and how that label can become a cage. I wrote about how families sometimes assign roles so early that children grow into them without consent. I wrote about what happens when the overlooked child stops competing for attention and starts building her own life. The more I wrote, the more I realized this wasn't just my story. There are thousands of daughters who learned to minimize their needs because someone else's emotions were louder. Thousands who mistook silence for maturity. Thousands who were told they were independent when what they really were was unsupported. One evening, Rosa called again. "You've been on my mind," she said warmly. "How's the writing?" "It's becoming something," I admitted. She hesitated before adding, "That journalist I mentioned before?" She followed up. "She's interested in telling a story not about scandal, but about resilience." I walked out onto the balcony as we spoke. The mountains were dusted with early snow, the air sharp and clean. "I don't want this to be about tearing anyone down," I said. "It doesn't have to be," Rosa replied. "It can be about stepping into your own life." After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. My grandfather had collected articles about my career like they were treasures. He had seen my competence, my drive, my integrity, but he had also seen my loneliness. He had understood that success doesn't cancel out emotional neglect. That night, I pulled out the folder of clippings he had saved and spread them across the desk. I added a blank sheet of paper beside them and began drafting something new, not a defense, not an exposé, but a testimony. Not about what my sister did, about what I survived. Weeks later, Dr. Keller visited again. We hiked a short trail behind the house, the path winding through tall pines. "Do you ever regret not pursuing legal action?" he asked carefully. I thought about it. "No," I answered. Accountability happened in the room that mattered. Everyone saw, everyone heard. Dragging it through court would have kept me tied to it. He nodded. "That's rare clarity." It wasn't clarity at first, I admitted. It was exhaustion. I didn't want my life to revolve around proving something again. For 35 years, I had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. I wasn't going to spend the next 5 proving that I deserved to breathe. The seasons shifted gradually. Summer green faded into autumn gold. My lungs adjusted to the mountain air more comfortably than doctors predicted. I found a local clinic to monitor my condition, and the staff treated me not as fragile, but as informed. There's a difference. One morning, while sipping coffee by the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked different not because of the scenery, but because of the absence of constant self-doubt. For most of my life, I measured myself against Hannah's reactions. Was I too blunt? Too ambitious, too emotional, too distant? Now there was no comparison, just me. Sometimes, healing feels lonely at first. There's no chaos to distract you, no drama to define you, just space. But space is where identity grows. I don't know what Hannah feels now. I don't know if she sees things differently or if she still believes I overreacted. And strangely, I don't need to know. What I needed was acknowledgement, and I received it from my grandfather, from witnesses, and eventually from myself. The girl behind the tool shed who tried not to cry too loudly would not recognize this version of us. The woman who can say no without shaking. The woman who can accept love without suspicion. Sometimes I stand on the balcony at dusk and reread the inscription inside Grandpa's old poetry book. "One day you will understand your own worth." I finally do. And the most surprising part? Worth isn't loud, it's steady. By the time winter settled fully over the mountains, I had been living in my grandfather's retreat for nearly 6 months. Snow rested quietly along the roofline and softened the edges of the world outside my windows. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full of wind through pines, full of space to think, full of something I hadn't known how to name before. Safety, not just physical safety, emotional safety. The kind where no one is waiting to reinterpret your reality. No one is preparing to minimize your pain. Some mornings, I wake before sunrise and sit in the reading chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the first light spill across the peaks. I think about how close I came to believing I was fundamentally invisible. How many years I measured my value against someone else's volume. It's strange to realize that the defining moment of my life wasn't when my sister pulled out my oxygen tube. It was when I decided not to let that moment define me. The journalist Rosa mentioned eventually reached out. Her name was Claire. She approached the story gently, carefully, not interested in scandal or accusation. She wanted to understand the dynamic, the overlooked daughter, the golden child, the quiet shift when truth is finally spoken out loud. During our first phone call, she asked me something simple. When did you first realize you were allowed to want more? The question lingered long after we hung up. Allowed. For so long, I thought asking for equal love was selfish, that being disappointed made me dramatic, that needing protection made me weak. I told Claire about the tool shed, about the hospital room, about the will reading, but I focused less on Hannah's actions and more on my internal shift. The moment I stopped trying to convince people who were committed to misunderstanding me. The article, when it was published, didn't mention names. It didn't sensationalize. It told the story of a woman who chose boundaries over retaliation, distance over destruction. And something unexpected happened. Emails began arriving. Women from different states, different backgrounds, different ages. Teachers, nurses, corporate managers, stay-at-home mothers. Each one saying some version of the same sentence. I thought I was the only one. They described being the dependable sibling while another was excused, being praised for resilience while secretly aching for softness, being told they were strong when what they needed was someone to stand beside them. I answered as many messages as I could, not as an expert, not as a therapist, just as someone who understood. One evening, after responding to a particularly vulnerable letter from a woman who had just gone no contact with her own family, I stepped onto the balcony again. The sky was clear and scattered with stars. The cold air filled my lungs sharply, cleanly. I thought about Hannah, not with anger, not even with sadness, just awareness. I don't know if she will ever fully understand what she did. I don't know if she sees herself clearly now that the protective narrative around her has thinned. I've heard through relatives that she's working steadily, slowly rebuilding, that she avoids family gatherings where my name might come up. There's no triumph in that knowledge, only consequence. Sometimes people ask if I regret cutting her off completely. The truth is, I don't regret it, but I don't celebrate it either. It wasn't a dramatic door slam. It was a quiet closing, a recognition that proximity to someone who denies your reality erodes your sense of self. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means releasing the expectation that someone will become who you needed them to be. My relationship with my parents is cautious but improving. Therapy has forced conversations that never would have happened otherwise. My mother once admitted, through tears, that she confused Hannah's neediness with vulnerability and my independence with invulnerability. "I thought you didn't need us," she said. "I needed you differently," I answered. That difference matters. We're rebuilding slowly, not as the family we were, but as something more honest. Dr. Keller still visits occasionally. He jokes that he never expected a professional promise to a patient would lead to hiking mountain trails and drinking coffee on a wooden porch months later. But he understands what this place represents. "Your grandfather wanted you to breathe freely," he told me once. He didn't just mean physically. I keep his poetry book on the small table beside my chair. The inscription inside no longer feels like a prophecy. It feels like confirmation. One day you will understand your own worth. I do now. Worth isn't something your family assigns. It isn't something you prove through achievement or silence or sacrifice. It exists independent of their perception. There was a time when I believed justice required punishment, that accountability meant public ruin. But standing here, watching snow fall softly over trees my grandfather once walked beneath, I understand something deeper. Justice can look like clarity. It can look like boundaries. It can look like a woman choosing not to shrink anymore. I don't tell this story to paint myself as extraordinary. I tell it because invisibility thrives in silence. And there are women out there right now who believe they are too much or not enough, simply because the people closest to them never adjusted their lens. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not dramatic for wanting fairness. You are not weak for needing protection. And you are not selfish for stepping away from those who refuse to see you. Sometimes the most radical act isn't revenge. It's refusal. Refusal to keep auditioning for love. Refusal to absorb harm quietly. Refusal to let someone else define your capacity. As I close this chapter of my life, I don't feel like a victim who survived. I feel like a woman who finally stepped into her own light. The mountains outside my window don't care about family dynamics. They don't measure worth. They simply stand steady, unmoved by storms. I think that's what healing looks like. Not loud, not vindictive, steady. And every morning when I breathe in that cold, clean air, I am reminded of something simple and profound. No one gets to decide whether I deserve it. I already do. What this story was never really about was inheritance. It wasn't about money, property, or even the will reading that exposed long-buried truths. At its core, this was a story about visibility, about what happens when one child is assigned strength and another is assigned fragility, and how those labels can quietly shape an entire life. It was about a woman who almost lost her breath, and in doing so, finally found her voice. April's journey reminds us that justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it looks like walking away, and sometimes it looks like choosing peace over proving your pain to people who were never willing to understand it. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your family, like your resilience was mistaken for not needing love, I hope this story made you feel seen. You are not alone in that experience, and you are not wrong for wanting more. If stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to Hanjiwe Yagi. This channel is a space for voices that were once quiet, for truths that were once hidden, and for anyone learning to step into their own light.